we have bedonged the top of the hour, we will give people just a few more moments to come in. And while we are waiting,
Elliot, do we have the someone taking meeting minutes?
yes, we do.
Who is it?
Let's see here, and that person is.
I'm doing that, Hannes.
Okay. Excellent.
Brian. Though with our meeting tool, with our note-taking tool, Brian doesn't have to be alone. If you'd like to help him with the minutes, it's all done very nicely online, so you can join in the fun.
Yeah, I hope folks know where to find the meeting minute tool. It's actually on the top of the bar, if you look around.
Hi, everybody. Just for a few people who might not know how the data tracker, sorry, the Meet Echo works. So the hand at the top left under your name at the screen is if you want to speak out, then you in queue. If someone else presses the hand before you, like I'm pressing the hand right now, and I'm in queue now. So if somebody else presses his hand, they get in queue. And so exactly. So now the chairs know what's the order, and you can still talk while not being first. So you can talk over each other. It's like a real room. So this is Meet Echo 101.
But it's
also fun.
Some people asked. There's also a chat panel, which is next to the participants list on the left-hand side. So you can, if it doesn't open for you, just click on it. That should do the job. You should see that, and you can send some messages to the chat window.
All right, shall we go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
So welcome everyone to the SCITT-BOF. This is a non-working group forming BOF, and the first thing I would like to draw your attention to is the note well statement. Now, I am aware that there are a number of people who are new participants to the IETF processes. To you, I want to say, on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Hannes, a special welcome. Welcome to the IETF. So the way we start things off at most of our meetings, and pretty much all of our meetings, is by letting you know about our policies. Like any standards organization, we've got a lot of them. So I'm not going to read this out. I know at some standards organizations, they read out their policies in the beginning, but this is the note well statement. It will be in the minutes. Please take a moment, because what it basically says is if you're going to make contributions to this meeting, then you're agreeing to certain rules. Both in terms of IPR, in terms of code of conduct, which I'm sure won't be a problem here, and in terms of understanding our processes. Now, we have a couple of ways that we go forward in these things, a couple of traditions. And the first tradition, when we present the agenda, is to agenda bash. So first of all, we can congratulate ourselves at having gotten through the first agenda item, so we can't bash that one off the agenda. Everybody has gotten to see the note well. The agenda that we have planned for the SCITT-BOF is as follows. We're going to take a few moments just to give a brief introduction to the IETF processes that you might encounter. Then Yogesh is going to spend some time on a problem statement, and Kate is going to talk about an initial use case. Then Hank is going to give us some view as to what we think the scope of standardization is. And then there's going to be some discussion. Now, if you scroll along the participant list, you will see people with various colored dots. And I want to just point out a couple of things. The first is that there is an area director who arranged this BOF. He's online, that's Roman. There are a couple of members of the Internet Architecture Board, I think, they have the red dots. Roman has a yellow dot for the IESG. And then people who are working group chairs have blue dots, and you'll see an occasional, I don't know if that's purple, pink, whatever you want to call it. Those are members of the Internet Research Steering Group. This is the IRTF side of the house. Those are the researchy people. So occasionally you might hear interjections from these leaders of the community. Now, once we've gone through discussion, we'll spend 5 minutes of wrap up. And then this is the time when you get to change the agenda. Now, the rules about anything that we do in our discussions is we tend to do things by rough consensus. So that doesn't mean everybody has to agree, but it certainly means that most people have to agree. Does anybody want to bash the agenda? Okay. Hannes, do you want to add any comments on the agenda here, or shall I just proceed?
No, move on.
All right. Moving on. So I've created just one slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some text that's not there too. So, like any standards process, there's, a lot of things that you do to create a standard. But it all starts with a good idea. And the good part about that is you're probably past that part. Now, the other thing that it's really important to have throughout this process is a community of interest. Look at this. There are 52 people on this call. There's a good chance you're beyond that as well, but we're going to test that over time. So this is a non-working group forming BOF. It's pretty much a discussion. We'll talk about some desired outcomes in a little bit, but we're not going to start this the process of forming a working group, which is sort of your first step into creating a standard at the IETF, until the next BOF. And exactly when that happens is still a discussion, and it's up to the Internet Engineering Steering Group to decide whether that will happen in Philadelphia later or not at all. That's up to them. But they take their cue from the community, and they'll talk a little bit about what they'll want in that process. I see Roman has his hand up. Roman, you probably want to say a few words.
Probably only a few words. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump in and say, Elliot, I mean, you're laying us out great. Elliot and Hannes, kind of thank you for agreeing to share this. Just as a procedural thing, you've already mentioned that this is a non-working group forming BOF, but just to bring everyone up to date, the IESG was discussing today at the telechat what would be the upcoming BOFs for Philadelphia and IETF 14. So if it helps structure the discussions, we have tentatively approved this BOF also to convene in Philadelphia. So if we want to figure out how to stretch the conversation between two meetings, that's really what we have here. If it turns out that we end up with something that we can't manage out of this meeting, and I don't want to prejudice or kind of presuppose how it's going to go, but if it doesn't go well, we can potentially pull it back, but we can plan for being able to convene in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Roman. You could probably plan, therefore, to get into the next birds of a feather session where we do have that working group forming BOF, and that takes a slightly different structure than what we have today. There are specific questions that will need to be answered in the working group forming BOF, and we can get into that as we plan for that. Once a BOF is had, the IESG and the community will discuss and debate the charter of a working group. And then once the working group is formed, some chairs are chosen, everybody joins a mailing list, and discussion happens. Drafts are written. Some are adopted into the working group process, and then those go through the approval process. How long this takes largely depends on, it's very dependent on the topic and the level of interest. If there's not much level of interest, it might take forever. If there's a lot of interest, things tend to get pushed along, but it also depends on the complexity of what's being standardized and the shared vision of what people have. So what's very important in the second BOF will be to develop that shared vision in terms of a work plan that can be executed in some relatively fixed period of time. I won't get into any more process at this point because I think people are really dying to get into the meat of this BOF, other than to ask, Hannes, would you like to add any comments here?
No, I think it's I think you laid it out quite well, and I think we should jump in straight into the meat of it.
Okay, before I do that, are there any questions at this point? All right, very good. Everybody's really excited to get into the meat of it, which isn't me talking, but it will be Yogesh talking. So before I do that, let me just stop sharing for a moment. Let's see here. And I will bring up your slides, Yogesh. I am sorry I had difficulty with the share what slides are in there. So just give me just a moment to go pull those up. And
taking a chance to do a brief mic check.
Yep.
It works.
Awesome.
Okay, just
And
a
as we
moment.
go through the presentation, write down your questions or note them somewhere, because we'll try to get through them. We have allocated roughly an hour for those, and then we have a big chunk of discussion time. So I hope you guys have come along with a lot of questions. You've seen the slides being posted to the mailing list already, so some of you may have had a chance to take a look at them and think about some easy or difficult questions for the speakers and for some discussion points.
Right. Now I'd like to invite Yogesh to guide us through the first part of this discussion, which is the problem statement. And Yogesh, just say next slide when you're ready to advance.
Elliot, wasn't there one slide before that talked about like what
Yeah,
we want to
I think
accomplish?
that's what I want. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so great. At the outset, I would like to welcome all of you here who have taken out their valuable time and come here to participate on a healthy discussion about supply chain security, which is a major challenge faced by industry today. So I really appreciate your time, and we look forward to a great discussion today. So here is a brief kind of agenda. Uh, Basically, here is the um, uh, core of the intent of this non-working group forming BOF, that we really want this outcome, that people review this the material and generates explicit interest in solving the illustrated problem statements, and we work towards a goal of standardizing this in the IETF. Yeah. So I will be covering the first section of the slides, which is problem statements. So we hear what the aim is to clearly define what the problems or what the challenges we face in the industry today, and then we'll go to the subsequent sections. So next slide, please. So to introduce the problem, we present here a notional supply chain workflow. What I'm trying to present here is that this is a very simplified model, because the real world industry is much more complex. But to kind of focus on simple thing first, here we show a simple supply chain workflow where a producer A is involved in producing a component. It could be anything. We can, for the moment, we can assume it as a software component or something, and that has been designed, then built, tested, and produced. It creates a product A, which is then used or acts as a basis for creation of two more products, which forms as the basis and used in two more products, which is produced by two producers B and C, and it is eventually manifest itself as product B and product C, which is consumed by consumers B and C. So that's how simplified. And we would see on the next slide how that can manifest itself if we add some kind of a workflow of supply chain security, transparency, and trust into picture, where we briefly want to show here that the producer A, which is producing a design or whatever deliverable, it produces some data about it, which then gets signed, and a notary validates it, who identifies the producer, who identifies the claims about it, and notarizes it, and let it allows the producer to introduce that the claims into a store, which then can be taken forward and utilized by the um, producer of items B and C, and subsequently a same process is followed and is creates items with consumer B and C. Here, what we are trying to emphasize is that there is an open transparency in the framework, and things are designed in can be presented in a way that is much more auditable, much more accountable, and in open fashion. Next slide, please. And subsequently, there is a mechanism of multiple auditors at multiple level who can check the data store to check for the claims, verify the claims, and then reintroduce something about the auditing report back into the data store to say that yes, on a so and so date they have audited this, it all looks good, it all complies to the standards which they were looking for. Next slide, please. So what challenges we face in the industry today? So looking from different actors perspective, let's say I'm a producer of a product, so I don't know how to gather compliance evidence of how can I produce evidence about what I'm producing. How do I share it in a uniform fashion across the industry so that people can inspect it? And because there are so many different formats, there is no standard way where to put it, how to put it, and what to put it in a homogeneous manner, because there are so many different clouds and so many different formats. So it's extremely complicated and complicated and confusing. Next slide, please. On a similar scale, thinking from consumer's perspective, he is utilizing the end product, he is ultimately the user of the end product. How does he verify that, okay, whatever I am receiving today as a product, which is a combination of multiple sub products, how do they meet compliance? Is it safe to utilize, safe to use? Is it secure? Does it meet my quality bar, quality requirements? Is it sustainable? Those kind of things, how do I check it? Because there is no standard way to promote this kind of quality checks in the consumer's environment. There is no standard way to check the compliance of these things. And subsequently, once assume that the product is utilized, and after say a certain amount of time, I want to check that has it developed any vulnerability? Do I run what malware scan or anything? I don't have a standard mechanism to run that and introduce that back into the system to say that yes, I have done this check, it all still looks good. So I don't have an subsequent verification techniques to the already shipped products. Yeah, next slide, please. Sorry, one, yeah, auditor. So as a subsequent, it is not just the consumer and the producer and the consumer in the ecosystem that needs to act in a certain fashion. There are auditors as well which do check about the compliance to make sure that the everything is in place, the evidence is generated in the right format, the claims are validated, uh, the claims can be validated in the way it should be validated. So the whole process of auditing is not in a standard fashion. So because there are so many different solutions and so many different ways of doing things, so there is no standard way to audit the claims as well. Next slide, please. So here basically what we have come up with a definition and terms which we would be extensively using it in the subsequent set of slides. So this slide introduces these terms, and I will try my best to explain what these term means and how they are related to the supply chain scenario which we have a problem to address. So the claim is basically any producer produces an artifact or a product. A claim is something which describes that who has produced it, wh- what are the ingredients, what it comprises of, what quality assurances or what testing has been done, anything related to the which um, wi- describes the product in a way that can be verified is a claim generated by the issuer, which then can be introduced in a system where there is a registration policy, where not anybody can submit these kind of claims. Only authorized actors whose identity can be established are allowed to submit these claims into a system. And there is a notary in here which checks that the identity which is submitted is genuinely the correct identity. I know the person, I can validate that before letting it go into a system known as transparent registry, which is the next one in the slide. So basically, what is transparent registry? The transparent registry is effectively a store for a data structure which is consistent. It is append only, so it can you can only add things, you cannot delete it. It's a cryptographically verifiable record of things which which you can subsequently query and make sure that they are all present, and you can verify those, because once you enter your claims into the transparent registry, you get a receipt which is effectively a verifiable proof that so and so issuer has introduced so and so claim, and the receipt will have all the documentation which will be returned from the store or the registry, so that subsequently that offline verification of registry can be done. Next slide, please. So this is just a sample example. We have tried to explain how the notary would kind of notarize the stuff before it gets into the registry. Is it can mention that it has audited this type of document, SBOM document. It has who has done this introduction, and how I can add additional notes about what it wants to add about the identity or specifically about the claim. It can add what security standards it has followed, or whatever additional metadata it wants to introduce can be done. Next slide, please. So this slide basically, what is the motivation behind doing this? Well, we understand that we want to do things in a transparent manner, so that basically we can audit it. Any in a closed ecosystem, designated actors can verify that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone cannot, authorized supply chain actor may not, uh, will not act in a rogue manner, or it will not generate false claims. We admit or we acknowledge that that is very much a possibility, but doing this stuff in the way we are trying to say here makes them accountable, that if anybody detects the such kind of a claim, they can be attributed to, and they cannot contradict later that they were not the ones who did that. So they cannot even contest the roles played by auditors who have audited it, or the notary who has notarized it. So this makes it more secure in a way that the transparency adds more security to it. It doesn't stop it from bad actors acting it, but once it is detected, it can be quickly, action can be taken, and remedial action can be made in a very rapid manner. Next slide, please. So here are the challenges and pain points we face in the industry today. Is that we don't have a consistent methodology to identify and attribute the persons who are issuing uh, uh, the or producing the claims, or person who is producing the supply chain entities. Neither we have a consistent method to notarize the stuff or countersign to say that yes, we have seen who is the actor, what it is producing, and the linkage between the actor who is producing the stuff and uh, the actual product which it is producing. And because the pain is aggravated because there are multiple data sharing platforms and different protocols for various artifacts and claims. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what we are proposing is a draft problem statement. This is not a final statement, so to speak. This is open for discussion, and that's why it is called as draft. Feel free to once we have a discussion floor open, feel free to debate on this and try to improve it, because we believe that it is a collective community effort where we would land up in the defining the right problem statement, and once we have the right problem statement, will lead us to finding the right solution. So the challenge is, according to us, the challenge is that because of supply chain digitalization and the vast increase in the complexity, the size and the scale of the supply chain, uh, the traditional methods of normal auditing or securing the supply chain is no longer applicable. This is primarily the problem. Now, once you increase the scale, the problem is there is no proper way to attribute this or to formulate the supply chain data and generate claims to associate to that data. And then there is no standards for defining how the data stores and how we can align the data stores and how we can make this transparency work. There is no defined standard, so this aggravates the problem. So what we are trying to propose here is simple set of building blocks that could guarantee long-term accountability and interoperability of the software components, so that when the supply chain crosses different regions and boundaries and different organizations, there is a consistent method to verify everything about the supply chain so that the community is greatly benefited. Next slide, please. I think I have covered the problem statement. I would lead it back to the organizer so that how he wants to frame that. Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Yogesh. Now, before Kate presents, we have another tradition at the IETF, which is if you need to ask a clarifying question about what Yogesh presented. In other words, if you were confused about something he said, or if you just didn't understand something he said, now is a good time just to ask if it's a clarifying question, not for discussion, just a clarifying question. Does anybody have any of those? Actually, Yogesh, you did a great job apparently, so congratulations on that. And now I'd like to hand it to Kate. Kate, if you will take the floor, you will then present the supply chain use case. Kate?
Sounds good. Next slide, then, please. Okay, so software supply chain is what we're all focusing on these days. And as Yogesh has pointed out, it is very complex, it's dynamic. There are places that are transparent, there are places that are obscure, but we've all got to work it all together. So open source is certainly a large component of this, and the rate of change of open source is, I wish I could give you a good stat, but I'm going to say it changes very frequently to the extent that certain projects, like the Linux kernel, have something like 9 changes per hour going into them, and those are bug fixes and things like that. So we've got a fair amount of velocity, and quite frankly, as patches come in, as releases come out, as dependencies are tracked, all of this is happening so quickly. To do it, accurate tracking of it is no longer possible manually. We need to basically get to the stage that we are moving it forward in an effective fashion. However, as is being pointed out, having some degree of transparency into the contributors and the composition is one of the areas that we need to figure out how to build up the trust from. And there's all these different participants, players, and you might go by, oh, I know this company, I trust this company, oh, I don't trust this company. That sort of intuitive knowledge is effectively still manual, and we need to be able to put the right checks and balances in place so that we can look at risk in a more systemic fashion. Be it components coming from third parties, be it components coming from open source. All of these have different judgments associated with it, and having a same language where we can assess these is a missing piece. So we've got various standards for conveying the software bill of materials format, like SPDX, which is there today. But how people share these documents is one of these open questions that that community isn't trying to define. We're looking for things to emerge outside of the SPDX scope. So next slide, please.
Kate, before you advance to the next slide, if you feel comfortable doing so, this goes to all other speakers when you're taking the microphone. If you don't mind turning on your camera so that we can see you, that would be appreciated. It's not required, but if you'd like to do so, it is appreciated. Thank you.
Just a second then. Okay, you got me now?
Works.
Is it coming through clearly? And
yes, we can see you now, Kate. We can see you now, Kate. Thanks.
Okay, fine. So the team that's been working on this problem in SCITT has been doing some market analysis. And just to give a bit of a lie of the land, we're hearing more and more from various governments and industries that they are going to be mandating having software bill of materials. That's a key building block for the transparency, but as is indicated, we need more than just these building blocks. We need to have a way of linking them all together and looking at things through time. And so this various SBOM formats have ways of tying themselves back to the software that they are describing, but how you can sort of trust the aggregate that the person has presented, has created it, and that goes back to the identity, and do you trust who has made it? So having standard ways of capturing identity and capturing how we can move this forward is obviously going to be the challenge we need to figure out how we can sort. And because there are so many people creating products, so much churn on the products, fixes for vulnerabilities, these are where we're going. And again, there's a crying need for being able to do this at a scale in a machine reproducible way. Next slide. So some of the requirements that have been discussed by the others, and I completely agree with. I'm not going to take credit for some of this. This is pretty much things that I completely agree with. But the statements made by producers must be identifiable. They have to be authentic, and you'll be able to track them and know when someone says, "Oops, no, I made a mistake. Here's the update." This is all has to be. We need a way of being able to do this, and there's been multiple attempts to try to get to this in various projects up till now. But we just don't have, I think, the language that's missing that we can all sort of rally around and build the tooling around. Auditing the provenance. You could take an SBOM today and you can go and match it up to the software, and you can make, there's certain things that you can do with the hashes and so forth to verify. But the identity is who's had it and how it has flown through parts of the supply chain, maybe opaque in certain cases deliberately, or they may be transparent when they're going back out to open source. So, but there's no visibility and the claims and the proof that's going forward with these today. And so getting these things together and then effectively getting it so we can operationalize and take the scale of our supply chains is the challenge. Next slide. This slide is something that came out of the NTIA SBOM effort, or parts of it did anyhow, and have been augmented since then. But the initial diagram was looking at the software lifecycle. And as you can see, various parts of artifacts come into play at various parts of the cycle. There are certain types of material that will come in during your producing, when you're basically sourcing and planning for something and doing your requirements. You may want to look at what the source SBOMs are, or if you have binary analysis, you may want to look at that. What binary, what binaries have you don't have the transparency you really want, so you try to do third-party binary analysis, or someone just gives you the binary for my product, and that's all you've got. That would all come in potentially with the software as people go in and look at developing and building. And then as they're developing and building, people are going to take and look at, hey, I've done these test results. Sometimes we want to keep that and track that forward. Or hey, I use this build tool chain for some of the safety work. You're going to need to have your full traceability all the way through this stuff. And hooking these things in and having it linked in a way that people could find and then do the right level of analysis after the fact is going to be key for having effectively a built SBOM, which is the output of a build for a product. And ideally that will trace its way all the way back from beyond the components back to the sources, and so that we can, because that's where the vulnerabilities are. Vulnerabilities happen in sources. But these are areas that the supply chains will be growing into. Right now, if we can get to components, we're doing well. But putting infrastructure in place so that we can catch what's going on from the builds, and then, quite frankly, as you deploy products into your system, recording and tracking exactly what configurations you've used will also tell you whether or not you're vulnerable. Because all the vulnerability, certain vulnerabilities, if you're not deploying certain functionality as part of your config, you're not vulnerable. And so you don't need to remediate if there's a patch, if there's a vulnerability in a patch that's there. So, you don't want to be remediating all the time. You only want to do it when you absolutely need to. And so we need that level of transparency as to how all this stuff is pulled together, it flows, so that we can do the right level of analysis and, minimize the false positives and just patch what we really need to do. But, as Michael's saying, critical infrastructure is going to need this type of information. Anything that has a safety critical function is going to need the full build flow of information and the build tool chains and the environment where things are built. And then, quite frankly, what is actually being expected to be deployed and configured on a running system. So one of the things I want to highlight out of this slide is the term SBOM can be used for all of these phases and all these different deliverables, and there's going to be different content in them too. It's not just a set of components and relationship between components. At the top level of what's there, we're also potentially looking at, okay, here's how I've deployed this component. So there's a lot of work to be done on the SBOM side to expand into this space. However, how we can trust this SBOM and the chain of custody and what's happened over time is not being necessarily tackled there. If you go to the next slide, to illustrate and to go back to Yogesh's points, you've got a product, X, the 0 version comes out, have an SBOM published with it, and then some user is going to take it, or quite frankly, multiple users are going to be taking it, potentially deploying it in different ways and recording that in their systems. And then we hear, oh, there's a vulnerability that's happening at some point. And then, someone from either a supplier or, comes up with a patch, makes a patch available. Well, there might be an SBOM coming out with that patch to say, hey, this applies to this product, and it might apply to 20 other products too, because it depends where in the source that vulnerability was, and has that source been used in different places. So we've got, a very multi-dimensions on, inputs coming in, and things can be reused in different places and on the output, and being able to have that clarity that, okay, yes, I'm going to, one specific supplier has released this product, X with that patch in it, and there's a new SBOM out, and then, some user wants to go in and update to it. We're going to need to be able to track that type of stuff. And as a user, you're going to want to know whether or not you've applied the latest, and how what you've just applied potentially relates to what was there before. And you may need to have, be able to roll back at some point in time because there's some other issue. and auditors are going to need to potentially come in. So all of these dimensions are in the software side as they are in, in the physical side, as Ori just is pointing out. And so how we can get ourselves to that stage where we have a framework around working with SBOMs as well as working with deliverables of software, and then letting people audit and apply appropriate risk assessment, I think is a challenge going forward. So next slide, I think, is pretty much restating the problem. Yeah, so in the discussion, we can probably further talk about it, but as you can sort of see, getting these types of building blocks articulated, like identity of individuals, what are the elements we want to try to share, like SBOMs and products and so forth, and having that language that we're also working towards, I think, can help us with this part of the problem. Next slide. There we go. Any clarifying questions?
Thank you. Yeah, clarifying questions, please. Just clarifying questions. Oh my goodness, we have like professional presenters here. You guys were super clear. Oh, John, go ahead, please. John Gator.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, there was a pause while I had to authorize my microphone. So thanks, Kate. Just on this one here, and some of you know us, so we deal specifically with legally meaningful evidence trails of state over time. So do you have a good handle, does the community have a good handle of what legally meaningful means in terms of sort of regulatory submissive, or just it's good enough to pass the sniff test, so I'll put it into a lawsuit, or is that also undefined?
Well, you do know that I am coming from the SPDX community, and our HR with the legal team is very active about a lot of these types of issues, which is, so yes, taking it to the standards of proof for risk in various policy engines. A lot of companies will not make their policy engines visible, but I think we will be having a common language for these engines to consume will help with the authentication over time. And yes, it does need to be at this stage, like right now, SPDX has hashes. Okay, expect to see hashes on all elements. So we have some degree of verification that yes, this SBOM element here corresponds to something physical. However, the overall SBOM and how we can make sure that's signed and it hasn't been tampered with, and we can get these supply chain issues. Yeah, we need to get to that stage, and that's why I think this is a very useful discussion.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Cabo just put in the chat, forensically ready. That answers my question. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank
then
you.
my answer
Before
is
we continue.
Sorry.
Just one comment on questions. When you take the microphone, just anytime you take the microphone, if you don't mind showing your face, it's not required, but if you don't mind showing your face, please do. Hank, is this a clarifying question for Kate?
No, actually, someone put his words of my whatever. It's been said. So legally meaningful is a scary term, and forensic ready is a nice term, and so in support, and that's it. Sorry.
So I was going to say, let's be careful to clarifying questions. Thank you. All right. Any other clarifying questions for Kate? Right then. Thank you, Kate. I was surprised it took that long for somebody to come up with that question about legally meaningful, but there you have it. Hank, I think you are now up to talk about the proposed standardization scope.
Very carefully clicking buttons, it just crashed on me when I was clicking too fast. So, yeah. So, hi, I'm Hank. I'm trying to scope this down a little bit. So, what we heard at the first presentation from Yogesh is that there's a lot of supply chains out there. They share a common problem, and that does not really scope well, because it's all the things, right? All the supply chains is a little bit too much. And then we had Kate present to us the usage scenario, the use case they want to focus on. That's well understood, and I think highly important, because it might be even more complex than a few of the other supply chains, and that's the software life cycle problem. So and I want to challenge, of course, but it's a problem actually. So so that's there. And now I will present six things that we will talk about scoping here. So we can vote them out, we can vote them in, we can also talk about them and understand what they mean. And I'm going to try to convey some meaning here for these 6 things. And one of the things is when you are working in supply chains and are a supply chain entity, you want to talk about your artifact, the thing you're supplying, actually. So you're a supply chain issuer. And that requires some common method to identify you. And not all of these are traditional identity documents, maybe. So it's very important, it's verifiable, and you can't take that back, what you said. And the really important thing here, that has to be valid for a long time for auditability. So there's the phrasing here, indefinite period. That means more than 2 years. I think that's a very important thing to focus on. So that what I think we should propose to be in scope. And then there is this thing you're saying. So now you're the issuer, you're the entity, and you want to state something about your supply chain artifact. Again, in this case, and Kate laid out that very well, there's a software life cycle. This is a statement about your software, for example. I think it's a very good use case. Now, everybody knows that supply chains are not fixed in difficult times, especially. So what you do is to have some interoperability on these statements. And this supply chain claims, we call them here claims, and now is an overloaded term, but just stick with me here for right a moment. So these are supply chain claims. You want to be them interoperable. So homogeneous is key. And also you want them somehow to be in support, to check them out about their authenticity. You just signed them, but it's just the claims. Now, you want to make it transparent that they happen actually, and you want to be simple for the things. You want to apply to the IoT, to simple things. You want to apply to large scaling things. So that requires a certain standardization scope on the claim set itself. And it requires a burden on the this is called supply chain claim storage. Here as the third item, some burden on the store of these claims, and I think there are some qualities to these stores that should be in scope of standardization, so that you cannot take something back that you said. You can add something that says, I'm not of that opinion anymore, but you should not be able to take something back. It should be, again, like more than 2 years long-term accountable for. You should see that this is literally not only I made this statement, but some entities on the supply chain really want to say, no, I was aware of the thing you said. They want to be able to have a proof that they understood and read that statement. So this is what we gave a statement made and statements read from the store here on this slide. And next slide, please. The other 3 items. So this boils down to some kind of receipt. You know, when you interact with that central unit, you want to have probably want to have. I have to mute this. I want to have a validated piece of data that tells me actually I trusted that transparency service. I trusted that store, that entity that retains these statements. And I have written to that. I want to prove to you I've written to that. And also I want to prove to you that I read from that. And for the convenience of this was a slide back somehow. For the convenience of conveyance, I'm still talking to slide 26. Oh, sorry. No, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. There was a glitch on my screen. It's probably just a meet echo. I'm sorry. So we are 12:25 now. So I want to have some validated proof, even offline, if I'm not connected to the internet, that I have read something from the store, and have that written something to the store. That's relatively relevant to people who really work with supply chains, especially software, because sometimes software goes into critical spaces, and sometimes software goes to a lot of things. And then you can't get back to the store and inquire an audit log, right? If you're in a small item, you just believe what has been said. So the trust in the store is important, not especially the trust into the statement. If you are smarter, if you're bigger, you come back to the store and then check the audit trail and just somehow become, and this is the fifth item, become an auditor. You can really trace back all the claims being made, have been made over time, over years, effectively. And I think that's also something we want to have in scope here for standardization. So all of these things sound very mighty, very powerful, but I think we can boil them down to very specific things that are just countersigning things. But where this is a solution thing, I'm not going there. The very important thing that you have a choice here, and there's a sixth item. I think we want to enable the choice for you to decide whom I'm presenting to the opportunity to make their claims, whom I'm presenting the opportunity to the choice of checking and reading the claims. And that is under a certain control. We are saying public notary here for this role. But what I think what we want to do here is to enable everybody to decide for themselves who will access which data, and that we want to make it very easy to check the validity of the data. Has it been stated? Has it been read? Is it there? And then it can be global. It can be super confidential and small. The statement itself can be confidential. It can be transparent to the world. That is up to the implementer. The building block I think we are focusing on here is the choice of system you want to build with this. And again, it can be that the publicity, so the transparency of your thing is to be scalable here. So I think that's a sixth item. And I think all of these 6 things are in scope. I'm looking at the time here, and we are good with time. So let's go with the things that, and this is all going to be bashed. This is all up for discussion. That is, try the next slide, please. That's the next slide. And that's the thing that we think is probably out of scope, because we don't, again, we are already trimming down generic supply chain problems to a very specific problem that is the SBOM and software lifecycle world. And still we want to have something more out of scope here. And one of the things that should be out of scope is how the exact component of the storage looks like, how a query language for that storage looks like, and how actual protocol looks like to get something from these entities that can do the read and write proofs, right? So that's all protocol. But I think we have to start with the core. And I think a lot of people agree with that. And that is one of the out of scope decisions here. I think that we want to present to you as a proposal. And then, of course, when you think about who shall access what and when and where, that's policy, that's compliance. It's okay, right? But we can't deal with this on step 0. I think we really have to provide the basis here. So yeah, at some point, probably, maybe, but not for now. That's out of scope, we think, as a proposal. And of course, and that's we have to really underline this, we do not want to reinvent any wheel here. So we want to make use of technology already being approved and even not only proposed or standardized by the IETF. So we want to do this to be applied to all the things. And most of the things today, if you count them thoroughly, are tiny. So maybe it's cozy to be something here. Maybe it's cozy that might help us here. And then we want to inherit lessons learned from the certificate transparency. think that's vital. We are not doing transparency of certificates here, but there are lessons learned from that should apply here, we think. But we don't want to redo the certificate transparency. That has been done. And then, of course, you know, if I build a system that basically, when you get a receipt from, says, trust me, that's more than endorsement. So we have a working group for that. That's RATS, the remote attestation procedures. Remote attestation procedures can literally give you evidence about the actual thing the entity did. It did everything it should do and nothing else with it, right? So that's technology being developed in the IETF. We're not reinventing that. We want to pull that up, but at some point, maybe not initially. So that is out of scope, of course, because that has been defined. And then when you talk about trust on the RATS level, you could add trust on a consensus level, right? There are something there's good experiences and bad experiences, I think, with consensus protocols. But if you replicate that same thing over and over again, if you have the resources to scale that horizontally, of course, the idea arises that you might want a consensus protocol to check on that. This is not out of line. Everything is doing the same way but you, so why should we trust you? So that is interesting, of course, but initially, not in scope, maybe. And then, as Kate just said, S-bombs are tackled hard and intensively today in a lot of places. And I think we don't want to pull that into here. So the payload, the statement I was talking about statements about artifacts, right? The artifact itself that is you described, like with an S-bomb, that's out of scope. We want to use all the S-bomb stuff. We want to do all the metadata stuff about the S-bombs. We want to do all the provenance and the connectiveness about them and how that works. That's nice. I think people are already solving this. We're not want to interfere with that. What we want to do is add this layer of interoperability for all the participants in a concise and meaningful manner that applies to a lot of small things and to very critical big things. And so I think the format of this various bills of materials might not be in scope right now. We might look at this again, helping with the encoding, helping with the protocols later on, but this is like far in the future. So when the people that are really expert in this have settled on something that is viable and they endorse. So that's the 3 slides I wanted to present today. And I hope that makes a little bit more sense now. It's all tied together. And I think the next slide is going already into discussion, isn't it? Yeah, it is. And this is the restate. Oh, so no, let's go with the next slide. It's fine. Because the next slide actually. Sorry?
Wait.
Okay.
Okay. The same question for you, for the related for everybody who's on the in the meeting. Does anybody have any clarifying questions for Hank? Okay, we do have a few. All right. So let's see. I see Hannes has taken the floor. Hannes, do you want to say something first? As a chair, you get to do that.
No. I think we should jump straight to questions.
Okay.
Because I think the next slide is also the discussion slide, so we might nicely transition over.
Okay. So Kay, let's start with the clarifying questions, and we will get into that discussion. Kay Williams, you should unmute yourself, and if you'd like, turn on your mic, turn on your camera.
Which is top left of the screen. There are a lot of strike-through images.
Yeah, I unclicked the wrong button, but now I think I've got them all. It's great to see everyone here. Thank you. Yeah, so my question is on the clarifying question is on the scope slide, and I asked this in the chat. There are some things that are listed as out of scope here that I think are very important for interoperability across the supply chain, which was identified in the problem statement. So I'm wondering, and I don't know if we can answer this right now, but if there's I do think it's important to say there are certain things that we'll start with and certain things that we'll get to later. So I think of it as potentially a more of a roadmap kind of question. It might just be more of a clarifying question from me about, how do other groups do this in the IETF? My preference would be to say some of these things are in fact in scope, but in a future time frame.
Yeah, that's. Sorry, shall I answer this or?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Hank.
Okay. Yeah. So the goal here is to agree on the core problem, and as you said, I think the right term, roadmap. So there are additional problems, of course, but we have to solve the first problem first. Take small steps. Yeah, and this is basically just to fence off all the scope creep, because all of this is interesting, of course. All of this people want to do, but in order to be successful here in the IETF, you really have to scope down to the core, and then when you're doing this, this will be the next 4 weeks if you get the chance to create some initial charter text about this. That would be this out of scope statement here would be for the first charter iteration. And if we're successful in fulfilling the duty that we promised to the ISG here with the charter, that we produce something that addresses core problems, then I think we get the benefit of doubt. Okay, you might be able to reel in the remote attestation, you might to reel in the other things, right? You don't reinvent the wheel, you're just using them. And so that becomes a roadmap along the way. Maybe the chairs have to add to that.
No, I would say there's no firm answer. It's up to the group to decide. But what will help things along, I think, will be as you're defining sort of the architectural building blocks, what you can pull in will become more obvious, and that will help you scope so that you don't redo other people's work, or if you do, you know why you're redoing other people's work.
Yeah, Roman said it quite nicely on the chat. So I think that's also good input.
You mean the art? It's an art.
Yeah, but he also says it can this question. I don't think this question can be answered in the abstract, and I also agree with that. It is a little bit tricky, but I think in general, like the scoping helps a little bit in informing others, like what's going to be done first, what's the main focus, and what is the group not planning to work on. I think those is useful information for those who come in and participate, right? So that they are not at the wrong place. And things can evolve from there.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kay. Ori, welcome. What's your clarifying question?
So it's essentially on the same bullet point. I feel like storage, query, and retrieval are, I can see very strongly the applicability for the storage layer, but I worry about interoperability without the ability to speak to some of the query or retrieval parts. So like while the internal storage mechanisms, I could see that being great to keep as a black box, I do see some potential harm in there not being some sort of externally defined interface for getting access to statements in a particular format. So I wanted to just ask, could you maybe separate them out a little bit in kind of how you're thinking about it, or just take another swing at it?
Yeah, okay, can I take another swing at this? So the IETF is reluctant and not very suited to the API level. But what the IETF can really do is talk about the messages conveyed. So the conveyance type might not be fully specified, but the conveyance format on this specific level for query, retrieval, and statement might have some prescription to it. I'm not sure how far and how deep. Again, we are not trying to disrupt the force with the SBOM folks, right? But on some, maybe it's just a thin metadata level that we want to have on the storage queue and retrieval. That's up to the discussion, I think, for chartering. If you're worried about that, I think we have to fence the point of concern a little bit more and make sure what's the actual problem we are solving if we would go there. I'm really reluctant, but I can feel that, yeah, if you have no guidance at all, then it's also not very useful, right? So, okay, maybe the middle ground here is the part that has to take next, would be the next steps to find it out.
Okay. Thank you, Hank, and thanks all the presenters. Thanks to all the presenters for introducing the topic. Now, this next part of the discussion is not presented, right? It's up to you to discuss. Here are some questions. These are what I would call starter questions, right? Is the IETF the right place to do this work? And I saw something in the chat from at least one participant who said, well, what here's not done? And I just wanted to make sure I'm giving the appropriate credit. That's Ned Smith who said that. And I think that's a good question.
Very quickly jumping in based on what so there are obviously lots of questions on the chat that we could discuss, but I just see one from Ori in response to what Hank said. And there's unfortunately, like when he said the IETF is not good at specifying APIs, and that's true for the old definition of APIs, right? Not the RESTful HTTP APIs, right? So you need to be careful here. So something, for example, a protocol that sort of HTTP-based thing that talks from some client to some server asking for something, and the response comes back. I don't see why that would not be in scope of the IETF. Yeah.
You're correct. I feel strongly corrected, and you're right. So, thank you.
But jumping back to you, Elliot, sorry, interrupted you on Ned's comment.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure that the point wasn't to try and get Ned's question answered necessarily, but simply to say this is everybody's opportunity to not only ask questions, but to state their views about these. These are good questions that we could look at. Please feel free to jump in. I hope that new participants feel really comfortable about speaking. You're more than welcome to ask questions. Presenters who have presented, please feel free to ask your own questions. You may have your own questions in this. So with that, I think we'll just start with a Q, Hannes, and go down.
Definitely, my channels are open.
Okay, Michael Prorok, and please, if I butcher your name, please tell me. Okay.
Yeah, no, you got it right. So thanks so much. And I'm sorry, apologies, keeping video off just because of rural internet issues. But I just wanted to get a bit of clarification around the API side. And I think the last thing I heard helped me quite a bit, which was that things like defining a RESTful API seems like it might be in scope, because I think if we look at validating and testing interoperability between different implementers of the standards, that has been a very helpful thing in lots of areas. And so if that's not in scope, I would have some strong concerns on that. At least having, a very basic, yes, I send this message, I expect in this format, and I expect this, and it's happening over HTTP, et cetera, or, something similar. Is there a little bit of clarification that could be offered around like a RESTful API from a test suite standpoint, et cetera?
I can take that, Hannes, if you want.
Go ahead.
So you're correct. You have to remember what we're trying to lead here is what scope we think needs to be solved in a working group. We're perfectly acceptable expanding it out, but we don't want to turn this into a massive amount of boiling ocean. really trying to target some things that we think are lacking that are stopping us from building this. If the consensus is that we kind of need some standard RESTful API for storage and retrieval, and we want to extend to that, then that's totally within the purview of defining what the problem statement is here. And I think that's, we're looking for feedback here is how much appetite there is and how far to go. Did that answer your question?
Chat as well, but I mean, I would definitely be interested in helping to specify a RESTful API on that, and in commit tests, et cetera. It's something we've been doing a lot of lately on our team, and it has been extremely helpful to be able to be like, yep, all 3 or 5 or 10 of us are all actually speaking to this standard in a testable way, which also helps with the industry confidence, right? When we're looking at adoption issues, right? And so when I think about customers we deal with out in the wild, that ability to say, oh yes, and if you want to plug into this is how we can do this in this demonstrable fashion. So if that API is not defined, what tends to end up happening is there's no common ground to meet on, and you wind up with all sorts of weird stuff and people saying they're doing something in relation to a spec, and then in reality they're not. And that's just a danger I've seen in other standards type stuff, and I wanted to avoid that here. So thanks.
Just to add a comment there, please. Pretty much the highest ideal we have in this organization is interoperability. And I think what you're pointing out is that at the 10,000 foot level, it's very difficult to perceive where the interoperability will be. And so as we begin to zoom in the next BOF, and as we begin to read the drafts, right, obviously the big test will be, can people build interoperable implementations? That's like the numero uno goal of the standardization process at the IETF, in my opinion. Roy, did you want to say more? I apologize for stepping over you there.
No, it was perfectly fine. The other half of this is, one of the things we did put in scope is standardization on what the first level auditability against an electronic equivalent of notary is. If we can't automate it and there's a standard set of APIs, then we're in a real world of hurt, right? So there's a level of how far we standardize surface area and how much we can automate and test. And I'm willing to change where that bar is and discuss with people what all has to be solved here. But yeah, there's definitely going to have to be some standardization on ways to test this thing and how to prove it. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge amount of manual legal discovery and all the rest of it, and that will never work.
Thank you, Roy. Christopher Wood, with a bouncing baby new RFC under your belt.
Yeah, thanks. I have 3 questions. In no particular order. The first of which is kind of a question about the assumption that the architecture makes, or the claims that it makes. That's a bad choice of word, because claim is overloaded in this particular document. But it focuses pretty heavily on this append-only data structure that's used by the transparency service, as it's called, to actually store claims, and I don't know if receipts are also stored on that particular data structure as well. I'm wondering if this is actually a necessary requirement for all known use cases of this type of technology, or if it's really something that's more like a nice to have feature for various applications. And I ask that because anecdotally and historically, running these types of data structures is not simple, especially at scale. Like certificate transparency turns out to be quite challenging to operate a log. And if these are going to be used a lot more than certificate transparency logs, it calls into question whether or not you can actually deploy this type of technology. So I'd like to better understand why this is being sort of proposed as an essential requirement, as opposed to sort of an optional piece of the architecture. Second question is on the I guess the type of identity that's sort of fundamental to the design as well. I think the draft, or the architecture draft, says that DIDs or decentralized identities are going to be like sort of the interoperable type of identity for everything. They will be the identity that like the producers, maybe I don't know if that's the right term, but the people who like make claims, they're going to sign with some DID associated key material. Ledgers and transparency services will also have some sort of DID associated with it. And I think like historically, IETF protocols and systems sort of like punt on this, like how identity is handled in systems. Like TLS, for example, sort of just punts and says, you know, like there exists a certificate for some in some PKI. You figure out like what PKI is relevant. We haven't used the web PKI for a lot of things, but that's just how it turned out to be in practice. So mandating a particular type of identity seems kind of problematic here. I'm wondering if that is also something that we could punt on, because this is already a quite complicated thing. I mean, it's quite large. And that folds into my third question, which is really on the, I guess, the more practical side of things. Like, who is like interested in like actually building out this stuff, testing it, and experimenting with it? Because it is pretty significant in scope and scale, and something like this to succeed through the standardization process obviously needs people to like, you know, write code and test it out. So I'm wondering if those people are here and can speak up. That seems quite relevant to not the working group, not the BOF now, because we're not forming a working group, but that seems relevant to.
Yeah, can I
that
just
point.
can I chime in on that one?
Sure.
There's actually been about 3 definite efforts that I'm already aware of independently have been happening. There's one that started about 3 or 4 years ago called Sparts out of Wind River, which was logging things onto a ledger that was aiming towards doing some of this type of information with using an envelope. The DBOM effort has been trying to going after this as well. And then there's another group of people who are looking at controls and risks and how to work with this in this flame that's sort of overlapping into this space. We've got a lot of people looking at this space, but we don't have the standardization of the terms and metrics. And so I think coming up with, here's how all these tools need to work and interoperate. I don't think there'll be one necessary solution. I think there'll be multiple solutions. I think it's going to be key to build up the vocabulary of concepts and building blocks that all these tools can use, because it won't be just one, I think.
If I could reply to that real quick. So yeah, I'm aware of these other efforts, but what I'm asking is like, I guess more direct, like, are they here, or are they interested in doing this? Like, are they willing to move away from what they're doing to this thing? I'm getting a thumbs up from someone, which is great. So I'm just hoping that would be the answer. But like, if we go off and do this thing in a corner and no one cares about it, that's not really useful.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to all of your points with at least my perspective. I think they're excellent, by the way. So I'll do it in reverse order if that's all right. In terms of interest, so my name's Sylvan Klepsch. I'm at Microsoft Research, and Microsoft is deeply invested in this. So in research, this is something that we've been keenly interested in for years now, and we've been working in this space and publishing in this space. But this is giving us an opportunity to actually reify that work, to actually work with the community and the world at large to make this happen. So we are actually investing significant full-time headcount into exactly this, into spinning up these systems, into doing research into new ways even to service these systems. So I'm in the confidential computing group. I'm highly biased in favor of hardware trusted execution environments and the kinds of interesting guarantees you can get out of that. But that's just my bias. I think something that Kate said just now about multiple solutions is really, really key. We want to make sure, and it ties into something that folks were saying in the chat as well about who runs this service. Ideally, many providers run this service in an interoperable way, and they don't necessarily all run the same software in order to provide it. Certainly, Microsoft will have an implementation that will open source and make available to everybody and allow anybody to use. We don't want any kind of IP getting in the way there. But if folks have other approaches, I think that's even better. This is too big a space for Microsoft to address it alone. Then going to your DID point, which I think is really important. Identity is fundamental to what we need to do here, because we need an idea that claims originate with some identity, but we don't want to go off and solve the identity problem. That's a huge space. To my mind, using DID is giving us a level of indirection to identity systems. We're not saying you must use some existing DID method. We're saying when you define an identity method, define a DID and a resolver that lets us figure out who you're talking about. And please do introduce new DID methods. It's a very open standard. I know Ori Steele's on the call. It's an area where you can really innovate and provide new solutions, and it allows this kind of work to be flexible as the identity provider. If you think that there's a better way to get that level of indirection, awesome. Let's talk. I think any other approach to indirection over identity is also on the table. I think going to the log question here, I'm afraid I have incredibly strong biases. My apologies. I think having the ledger is only part of the log problem. And the other part of the log problem is having independently verifiable receipts, because what we don't want is to introduce online checking of a ledger as part of people's deployment and checking and security policies. So you need to be able to say that the ledger is used for creation of claims only, never for validation or distribution, so that those independently verifiable receipts can be packaged, sent, put in container registries, sent via FTP, put on a DVD, because apparently it's the 90s again, whatever it is that people need to do to distribute this stuff, and that we're never online for that. And in order to do that, we need to be able to generate good cryptographic proof, such that we have not just tamper evidence, but tamper proof, where the holder of the receipt has of the counter signature of the independently verifiable receipt has evidence against the ledger has evidence against everybody, and everybody can support their position. If you think that there's another way to do that, to achieve independently verifiable receipts and that kind of tamper-proof guarantee, again, I'm super interested. I don't mean to say that there's only one possible implementation, but as a property, having that tamper-proof property and independent receipts, I think is critical. Sorry for taking so long.
No, that was great. Exactly sort of the clarifying answers I was looking for. On the last one, the keeping things offline and being able to ensure that things weren't tampered with. If there were deployments of this that were willing to compromise the complexity of running this log for an online check, would that be a reasonable instance of SCITT? Or this is a trade-off, right?
I think that's a great question.
Just if I may, while it is a great question and all Chris's questions are great, I'm going to ask Chris that there are other people who may also have some great questions after this. So, but please do, if you'd like to, Sylvan, answer that one.
Great. I'll try and give a short answer this time. My apologies. My honest answer is, while I don't think right now that would be a good implementation, please come convince me that it would be. If we can get the kind of security properties out of such an implementation that we're looking for, and we can make sure that stays interoperable with implementations that do provide those guarantees, well, let's talk about it. Let's figure out how it works. My bias right now is you can't do that, but come show me I'm wrong. I would love that.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sylvan. Ned Smith has been waiting patiently. Ned? We can see you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks for taking my question. I'm looking at the scope slide mostly and trying to understand really what it's saying in terms of what IETF needs to do that can't be done somewhere else. And in the case of the auditor, it mentions the word workflow, but it doesn't mention things like defining RESTful interfaces. So I'm trying to understand better is there something more implied by workflow as opposed to RESTful? And then the other one talks about defining processes and procedures for a notary. So I'm not immediately seeing what's the interoperability problem that needs to be solved. It seems like this is focusing on an internal process for a notary, so not getting, you know, the context here why that's even relevant. And additionally, it was noted on the chat that a notary is just essentially providing support for the identity of the participants. But if we're using something like DID already provides mechanisms for, you know, believability of the identity of the entity. So is there something that DID doesn't do that we need to do sort of along the lines of notary, or are we just, does notary refer to something else that we haven't defined it very well? And then of course, just the receipt itself, it seems like, you know, a bunch of groups are already defining the receipt, and if they can't agree, is that the purpose that IETF wants to be involved, is to help them agree on something, or is there something specific that isn't defined yet in the context of defining a receipt that applies to an interoperability, some kind of interaction?
Is there who would like to take a swing at that question? Is there somebody who would like to just jump in on that question from the presenter side of things?
I can take the receipt one. I
was going to suggest Ori take a swing at this, but I can take it if he doesn't want to.
I might need a quick refresher. The chat is very distracting and awesome.
Okay, well, let me answer the question then to what I understand. So the thing that's missing here is we've got plenty of options of what to move for in the IETF for identity. Right now, we have a lot of infrastructure built on CIA issued certificates, and we're opening it up to a discussion of should we pick a subset or something new in the supply chain, and if so, what's the opinion? Should it be SSH keys? Should it be DID web? Should it be DND, a new one? Because we keeping it open and saying, hey, we're going to support 100 things isn't going to work too well. We kind of need a vision of, do we want to move off of X509, right? The second half of this is today we don't have a way to know what your historical identity certificates are, right? You can say, hey, that's a DID document. Well, perfect. Okay, that's one way to solve the question. But is that the way we want to solve it for the secure supply chain? And how do I find that document is part of this discussion. The reason we use the notary here is it is historical that I'm going to use Ori here, that Ori's signature at a 5-year-old is still Ori when he's 35. And when he's 100, it's still Ori's signature. And how do we represent that in a supply chain point of view? Because we have products that live 10, 15 years. And that's why we're opening up a discussion to say, hey, what should we pick out of the plethora that have been opened up as to ways to solve this? Did that answer your question completely, or did I miss something?
If I were to translate that, I would say the digital equivalent of that is, do I maintain control of my key throughout my lifetime as a person? So it sounds like you were saying we needed to do some work to try and maintain, you keep track of key life cycles and ownership and something of that nature, but maybe I'm reading in.
That's fair. The other concept here is it's an entity, potentially not necessarily a person. Like it's the companies or the assigned project in GitHub that is generating the signing on the package versus a specific person. If you look at organizational-based mail for Asia, it's the security guard at the corner. It's not that Roy Williams that actually making claims or you send email to. And it's those sorts of things we need to work through. The other aspect of this, and Ori's schooled me many times in this, is do we want to use DID document as a way to track revocation or compromise? Or is that all based on claims? Or is there a combination of endorsements, negative endorsements on a product and the entries in the DID document? That's where it becomes a little bit fuzzy for me as to what the industry wants and is there a better way to solve this problem?
I know the DID groups and W3C are trying to address the problem of how does a user maintain control of their identity throughout their lifetime, and establish that their identity is trustworthy without using some centralized authority. If the goal is to essentially build on top of DIDs, it would be helpful to know what's wrong with DIDs such that we know what problem we're solving.
Well, picking DIDs is the decision, and the second one here is if, and I'll continue using Ori in this case because he's got his camera on, if Ori passes away and his electronic collateral disappears, we rely on human notaries for contracts to say that Ori purchased this. And so where does it transition from your responsibility to maintain your list to a fiduciary capability to say, hey, here's all the things that Ori signed over his lifetime?
All right. This is a good question for discussions in terms of what needs to be covered. I'm going to actually, I was going to ask a question, but I think there's still a lot of conversation that people want to have. So I'm going to take myself out of the queue just for the moment and say, Roman, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Just to be clear, I'm asking this question as no hat. So for those kind of new to the process, not as kind of the AD, but just as a participant in the group. So I'm kind of intrigued by this level of specificity we're talking about in terms of verticals, but at the same time, really trying to talk about abstract solutions. And some of what I heard as well was like, well, we want lots of options. And this is applicable to SBOM and kind of other things. So my first question is, are we actually expecting an end-to-end solution that everyone adopts? Or are we going to be providing a number of building blocks that someone else is going to have to take and assemble for their particular verticals? And then a related question, if again, we're back to saying we're solving supply chain versus having some adjective in front of kind of supply chain, do we have a sense for where we're making the demarcation about the guarantees we're providing? So like, for example, a reaction of what's in scope was, I read the first one, which is about the supply chain issue, and we're using the word verifiable. So there's a lot of ways to take that. For example, I can say verifiable in just the crypto sense, which is, it's a certificate. But like even in the certificate space, there's a lot of nuance, which is it like Acme style where, let's encrypt, like I can ask for one and I get it and who cares who I really am? Or are we going to do high fidelity verification, like show me your articles of incorporation? And that's what verifies kind of. So I'm wondering where we're trying to land in the level of kind of abstraction and ultimate tunability to have an end-to-end system.
I guess I'll take that one. When we started down this journey, we tried to keep it thinking about supply chains in general and say, hey, this is a systemic problem. But that's why the slide deck talks about producers and consumers in a generic sort of way, because we do manufacturing as well as software. The issue here is that if we take it too far down that road and we were looking for common elements that we're missing that we can't represent today, they said, hey, this is going to get too complicated too fast. So we kind of distilled it down to, if we wanted to solve the software supply chain issue, which is a huge focus at the moment, other verticals may be able to pick up some of our work and go forward onto broader stuff. But the primary focus, given the impetus by governments to go and mandate things, is kind of pushing us to work on solutions to here. Now, Microsoft for years have had a solution for code signing that is proprietary to Windows, Authenticode. And we're going, hey, that doesn't scale well, and we'd rather open this up and work through a better solution. And the US government, with their executive order, have also pushed the issue, saying, hey, we want you to hit here and here. And we realize that this needs some better solutions. That trying to do it with certificates that expire and roll over and keep track of this is super, super tough without some of the building blocks that we have that you expect today when you purchase a house. the human notar that comes to your house and signs off and records it in the book, well, the state can come back, or the province can come back and say, hey, prove me that Ori signed this. And we don't have that sort of functionality that we kind of need for these longer term things. Your question is correct. Could it be used for other things? Yes. But right now we're saying, hey, let's focus on software supply chain issues.
So one of the things I want to add to that, Roman, if it's all right, the two pieces that I think particularly I want to talk about is you mentioned solutions versus building blocks. And to my mind, of course, at Microsoft, we're going to build a full solution. And of course, we're going to open source it and offer to everyone. That's not an IETF effort. That's an open source effort. And we want to make sure that what we're doing is working for interoperability, such that there are standards for this, such that anyone can go and build something that can interoperate with our solution. If we're the only thing out there, hey, maybe that's a nice open source project, but it's not really a proper standardization effort. And I think the other one that you mentioned that is close to my heart is verifiability. I think that saying that we provide cryptographic verifiability is a great start. I think moving on to, I know I keep harping on it, but independently verifiable receipts such that you have actual offline trust is another huge part of this. But another huge part of this, to my mind, is in fact tied back into the RATS work and attestation, where particularly in software, when we can have hardware attestations of what actually happened that isn't a human claim, and take those hardware attestations, make those transparent, and make those part of your supply chain ledger with independently verifiable receipts. Now we're starting to build fully automated solutions with humans out of the loop. And I think that, to my mind, that's where we want to be headed. We want to allow for all of the intermediate steps along the way. We don't want to say you have to do all of these things straight away, but being mindful that this effort needs to incorporate that kind of long view of hardware attestation, where verifiability is not just a statement, I think is an important part of the work, to my mind.
Sure, I appreciate that clarification. I think as part of this, effort, putting the hat on is laying out what those assumptions are for kind of, you got to be this high to kind of ride, is going to be what we need to make sure we have a success criteria on the back end to say we got to where we needed to go. And that's going to entirely depend on the community of parties that want the interoperability as they come to the IETF. Because I think, to channel a little bit of what Chris said, to editorialize, is just kind of some degree, it'll be what the people that come to the IETF ultimately want. And we shouldn't jump to being kind of something generic above and beyond without having the validation that we know we're building something for that community. Thanks.
Ori, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was sort of, I guess, cued to respond to sort of part of that trade-off between the, generic applicability of standards versus some of the vertical specific use cases, like for software, for physical supply chain. I think at the core, at the heart of this, there's this common sort of problem around this transparency service and the representations of that service. And, my background's in cybersecurity, so apologies if this is taking us too far deep into the cryptography, but one of the things that's exciting about certificate transparency is that it uses these Merkle proofs. It gives us some new standard interfaces, but the domain is very focused. And we would love to be able to build on those same capabilities, but because of the way certificate transparency was designed, it's not exactly easy to directly port that over. So I think that certificate transparency as an RFC it's an excellent sort of example of, when you make that trade-off, you can get something that's narrowly focused and solves a problem really well, but some of those common building blocks can actually work for a lot of other cases. And maybe there's a bit overfitting in that particular use case. Like, for example, with OSI and COSI, those are common building blocks that you can use to build very many things. And I think certificate transparency is on the edge of giving us those tools that we need.
Thanks, Ori. Anthony?
Antoine, yes. So still on that topic I think there is we are almost getting into a chartering question, and the core of the issue is how can we technically qualify the property that we provide as a standard, and I think Sylvain mentioned his aspiration for the property of the end-to-end solution, but we also agreed that we need to narrow down the scope because we cannot standardize a full end-to-end solution. We have to standardize the precise mechanisms that are required for interoperability and for allowing people to build their own solution. So currently, if you look at the current SCITT draft, the decision is to focus on the technical property of transparency, which is this idea that you have offline verifiability and that you prevent the ability for equivocation by recording everything in immutable logs and relying on the cryptographic verifiability of the log. So currently, this is exactly the technical scope that is defined in the current architecture draft. And part of the question that will appear for the chartering BOF is whether this is acceptable scope or whether this needs to be expanded or possibly reduced. So one direction that Sylvain was mentioning for expanding the scope, for instance, is trying to also bring attestation in the technical scope of the security guarantee that we require interoperability for. That would probably be a controversial decision. But that's the kind of topic that will have to be addressed for the chartering part.
Good. Elliot, you prepared some questions so we can run them.
I do. I do have some questions, but I have one of my own first, which is just as a no hats. My one question is relating to the people who are using these logs or ledgers. That we mentioned that there might be a way to limit access, limit read access, I take it, to these logs. So one question about scope is, do we need to define the identity forms or a means to communicate those identity forms in order to handle the authorization for accessing logs? And keep in mind, right, that products tend to travel from manufacturers to, through rather lengthy supply chains. This is a whole supply chain thing. So do we need some sort of standard for, does the standard need to include that access control, particularly identity forms for that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe as the author of the architecture draft with Cedric, we can probably try to answer what we think about this. So in terms of the transparency property is based on the idea of something that is publicly verifiable. But this has to be a little bit refined to understand what it means, because verifiability is possible without having a full view of all of the contents of the ledger. So when you have a Merkle pass or a Merkle proof, it's possible to verify that proof even if the hash of some of the nodes in the Merkle tree are completely opaque to you. So based on this observation, it's possible to maintain verifiability and even offline verifiability of receipts without having to give full access to ledger to everyone. And then the consequence of this is access control is a mechanism that can be implemented by the transparency service in terms of providing access to the ledger. And there are two possible approaches that we can take. So one approach is to say that in the standards, we only define the APIs that SCITT compliant service should expose. And in that case, if we want to add access control to some of these APIs, that would have to be specified in the draft. Another approach is to decide that we don't even try to solve that problem at all, and that we essentially say that the public distribution of the ledger is up to the operators of the transparency service. And they can decide to distribute the ledger in any way they want, like just putting it on a public website or distributing it over IPFS or in the Ethereum blockchain if they want, or whatever else. So then access control becomes completely out of scope, and it's completely up to each operator of a transparency service to decide how to implement access control. So that would also be a possible approach.
I think I would like to add to Anton is that it could be a very transparency service policy decision, and whether to bring that policy as a standard is open for discussion. How we want to operate the transparency service as a fully, whether how much degree of access control you want to enter into that.
But let's try not to go too deep into the technical details because we are still quite early in the process. If that's okay, Elliot prepared some questions that are really high level, and we try to settle on the issue, on some of the more basic issues. Like Elliot, do you have a question about the a question for the group about the whether they understood the problem statement?
Yes, and so thank you, Hannes, and thank you. I'm going to ask Hank and Cedric just to hold your comments for now. One of the success factors for the BOF is whether there's a shared vision around the problem statement. Now, in this lovely neat echo tool, we have a poll mechanism. I'm going to start a poll. I'm going to ask two questions at the beginning, which is how many people think that the problem statement is clear? And then I will ask the reverse question, which is how many people don't think the problem statement is clear? So let's start with the first question, and you will see that the poll will have popped up in just a moment. And you'll see raise hand and do not raise hand. Do people see the poll?
Apparently.
Okay, yeah, looks good. We're seeing a lot of people raising their hands saying that they do think the problem statement is clear. This is good. In fact, everybody, it looks like, I won't say everybody has voted, but a good percentage of people have voted. Okay, last call. I'm going to close the poll in just a moment. Okay, and here we have the answer to that. Now I'm going to ask the opposite question.
I think next time you only need one. We just have the other people who disagree to not raise their hand.
Generally speaking, yeah, that's a fair point, but I'll just ask it in any case, since I said I would. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people aren't participating and they wake up and so. All right.
In the second call.
Right. So I'm going to give it just another moment. Okay. First of all, I think that this. I don't. The area director should be very pleased here, because if you just look at the results, there are a lot of people who like the problem statement. That is a big win right there. Now I have a different question. I'm going to stop sharing my presentation for a moment. The different question is a classic sort of working group forming BOFI question. Which let's see here. Why won't it let me type here? There we go.
I'm actually trying to get to the questions also that.
Gonna kind of just jump over the top. I see a bunch of people, a few people in the queue. Do they want to comment before we jump to the next question?
Hank, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so I tried actually, Roman, I tried to address one of your comments. I have to scroll way back in the time machine here to understand what your question was. I think it was something of rats.
Oh, hang on a second.
So
hang on a second, Hank. Is the question about, is your comment about the poll that we just did?
No.
Okay,
it was
hold
a
your
comment from Roman about the rats applicability, and I'm scrolling up so hard because the chat is live.
Okay, hold
which is nice.
hold your comment for just a few moments, Hank. We'll come back to it. Christopher,
I will do that.
Is it about the poll?
Yeah. I voted, or I put my hand down and thinking that it was clear because I wasn't sure how to answer it. In particular, like I think the problem description was clear, but it's not clear to me that it is the right problem to be solving. It seems like sort of what Roman was saying, or kind of getting at, that it's a bit too generic in many ways what the problem statement is. And so and Elliot, when you interpreted the results, you said something like, it seems like everyone likes the problem statement, which was not the question that was being asked. The question was, is it clear?
That's a fair point.
And I would like to understand if people think it's the right problem to be solving.
I think the way I would phrase it, if you don't mind, is this a problem that people wish to work on?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we can take the time to make that poll before I do anything else. And any comments? Is it the right problem?
I'd like Sorry, help me out. When we say problem, what is the origin text? We've talked quite a lot about this.
I'm not
back
sharing.
to the proposed slides.
Just a moment.
Exactly.
Let me share the slide again. Just a moment. Just a sec.
Yeah. So the problem is liked, but is it the right problem? Is a discussion about the problem. Am I correct here? So problem, yes, but working on it, yes or no. So how close is it to the actual problem space? Is that the question?
Yeah, the next question we are going to ask. Yeah, because like you may feel that there's a problem, but you're not interested to work on it. That's totally fine as well, because you have so many other things to do, right?
Okay, got it. Makes sense. I'm voting.
And please forgive my grammatically incorrect English. Hopefully it's an understandable.
Yeah, I think you were trying to say, like, is this a problem you want to work on?
Yeah, the people in the room, right? Not somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, that's
we
have one more question, which is really, are you willing to contribute to the process?
But that's a separate. Would be a separate question.
That would be a separate.
It's a working group forming problem, I guess. Yeah.
But it's still. Chris raised it, and I know this is a difficult question, even for working group both to ask on whether who is interested to implement or deploy something, even at that stage when you don't actually know what exactly you would be implementing and deploying in precisely, because we haven't developed it. Right?
Okay, just noting we're down 20 people, rough about. So this is not the initial room, but yeah, we can do this.
Okay, so these are all good answers. This is good feedback. Now, I want to reopen the queue. Hank, you wanted to respond to Roman. And actually, before we go there, just be very brief, because in about a minute I'd like to get into next steps. So just be very brief.
I can talk very fast. Roman was asking, what's the difference between the supply chain claim and the claim evidence in RADS architecture? So yeah, that's a discrepancy. The claim we're talking here in SCITT is the statement about the supply chain artifact. You are issuing that by signing it and putting it to the thing, and you get the receipt back with your claim. And then with the receipt, it becomes a transparent claim because everybody you want to see it can see it. That's a transparent. That's a proof basically added to the claim. So that's definitely not the RETS claim. Claim is a term to be improved, but for the sake of the argument, we were going with claim right now. So yeah, that is not a good choice. It is causing some confusion. We're aware of that. So again, the supply chain entity makes a statement, signs it, put it in there, gets the receipt back. That's a transparent claim now. So yeah, you're right. We can be better.
Okay, Roy, very briefly, you get the last word.
I had a question first, which is, this is a draft problem statement. Christopher's question is it the right statement? How do we morph this and make it better? Is the question I have for you, Hannes?
I think the answer is the mailing list. We will have to sort of discuss this on the mailing list and fine-tune it. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, that's a perfectly fine way to do it. And I think just focusing on a specific use case rather than saying we're going to solve all the supply chain problems all at once is perhaps a good way to start going about refining things.
Okay. I want to start summing up here. First of all, thanks everybody for the great conversation. Thanks to the presenters and thanks to all participants. We should talk a little bit about next steps. So in doing this, what I want to say is, first of all, the next step is, I think people should continue to discuss this on the mailing list. If you haven't joined the mailing list, it's SCITT, SCITT, at IETF.org. And if you go to IETF.org, you can find your way to the mailing list manager where you can add yourself. Then there will be a hopefully working group forming BOF, and I do see the area director in the queue. So I think rather than me talk, I'm going to let Roman talk about this part of the next step. Roman, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I sure am, Elliot. I mean, it's a great question to say, kind of, what are we going to do next? I mean, what I heard here, and kind of thank you for you as the chairs, and thank you for the proponents in the community kind of debating this kind of around that. We have a lot of interest in kind of supply chain, and we may even have a lot of interest in software kind of supply chain, which was not in the problem statement. We are going to have a BOF at kind of 114, and the hope is to turn all this energy and interest into supply chain into being something specific enough that we can get to a charter. The SCITT mailing list is absolutely the place we kind of need to start. We would like to have that conversation in the concrete at IETF 114. So kind of things like, what's in, what's out. How do we talk about what we do now versus what the roadmap kind of is? How do we sequence things? I think that's all in scope here. But we have a positive result here in that, there's an interest here around supply chain. I think the big question for us, and that is the chartering question, what specifically do we want to do here at the IETF, and do we have the critical mass of folks to do it?
Yeah, and as part of the BOF, sort of not under the charter text that we need to prepare for the BOF, we obviously have to answer those type of questions because we have to put something as milestones there. And Ned raised it quite nicely when he talked about the slides for the standardization scope and was asking some questions about that. Sounded to me like, what do those items, bullet items and graphics actually mean in terms of documents that we are going to deliver as a group? And I think that's definitely something that needs to be discussed on the list. Other things, in my opinion, there have been a lot of good questions flying by. I saw some of them, didn't saw all of them. So I'm planning to go through the list and then bring some of them up on the mailing list because, and also some of the questions that were asked, I think there is some room for more discussion. We are obviously limited in time. on this corner.
Okay, so that's I think that Hannes, you stated it well. We are really to the point. There was one thing we didn't put on the agenda slide, but we should cover it anyway. Is there any other business that needs to be covered today? And I see that there's nobody in the queue right now. Is there anybody who thinks they need to make an additional comment before we close the meeting? All right, then I want to thank you all for participating. Please participate in the mailing list. If there's no conversation that's taking place in the mailing list, that sends a very strong signal to the area director that there may not be interest. And so please do sharpen your, what's going to be built, right? That part of the charter. What are you going to cover? What specifications do you think need to be written? What problems need to be solved? Hannes, you said it as well as anybody there. And I look forward to seeing you all on the mailing list. Final comments, Hannes?
Oh,
thank you,
thank
everyone.
you all.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night, Hank.
Good night, Bob.
Can someone please stop recording?